They nearly killed an innocent man, and they almost got away with it. Detective Ray Kessler built the case. Warden Monroe signed the execution order, and the state prepared the needle, all while Frank Bellamy, a decorated veteran with no criminal past, sat in silence on death row for a murder he didn't commit. But when they picked Frank, they didn't know who they were messing with, because behind those prison walls waited more than a man. There was a loyal dog, a relentless fiancée, and a truth buried under years of corruption. They didn't know Frank was a survivor, and they never expected the case to unravel at the 11th hour. What came next wasn't just justice, it was reckoning. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one man, it's about all of us. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window of the final holding cell, casting a pale glow across Frank's worn hands. Outside, footsteps echoed. Inside, time stood still. Justice was late, but it was coming. The fluorescent lights buzzed low above cell B14, where Frank Bellamy lay awake on the narrow cot, staring at the cracked ceiling. The prison walls, thick with silence and the faint scent of bleach, had swallowed 5 years of his life. Tonight, they were preparing to swallow the last of it. At 52, Frank's shoulders were still broad, his voice still steady, but his eyes, those tired, storm-colored eyes, had dulled with each sunrise that promised nothing but another day behind bars. He had once been a decorated Marine, then a security consultant. Now, he was inmate 39,812, awaiting lethal injection for the murder of a wealthy businessman, a crime he had denied from day one. Only the chaplain came anymore. No visitors, no family, not even a phone call. Just the echo of old memories and the cold whisper of steel against steel when the guards walked by. But Frank wasn't just another condemned man. What haunted him wasn't death. It was the lie that brought him here. He had been found blocks from the crime scene, blood on his clothes, his fingerprints on a knife. All circumstantial, he'd said. All explained, but no one listened. They called it an open and shut case. Fast trial, cold jury, and a lawyer who looked at Frank more like a burden than a client. Tonight the guards would move him to the final cell, the sterile room that sits like a shadow beside the execution chamber. Frank had never seen it, but he'd heard stories. White walls, a narrow table with straps, a window where nobody he knew would sit. He closed his eyes, not to sleep but to remember. The smell of his old pickup truck, the sound of boots on gravel, and a pair of blue eyes that once looked up at him with absolute trust. His dog, Shadow. In that moment, he whispered aloud, "I never stopped telling the truth." Then came the stillness, a hush before dawn, the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath. Have you ever felt the weight of being unseen, unheard, even when you're screaming the truth inside? That night, in that cell, Frank didn't fear dying. He feared disappearing before anyone ever believed he mattered. The ticking clock in the guard station struck 3:00 a.m. when Frank Bellamy stood up from his cot and approached the small steel door of his cell. He pressed his fingers to the cold bars, cleared his throat, and called out in a voice that sounded smaller than it used to be. "Officer, I'd like to make my last request." The young guard, barely out of training, paused mid-step. He looked at Frank, then down at the clipboard he carried. "You've still got time to think it over," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I've had 5 years to think," Frank replied, eyes unwavering. "I want to see Shadow, just once, before I go." A dog, his old German shepherd, was all Frank asked for. Not a fancy meal, not a priest, not even a call. Just the dog he'd rescued as a puppy from the side of a rain-soaked highway. Shadow had been loyal when the world wasn't, slept by his bed, watched the door while Frank slept, followed him to the mailbox like a child too proud to say, Don't leave me. The request traveled fast, up to the unit supervisor, then to the warden herself. Warden Clarice Monroe was known for following rules to the letter. But when she read Frank's request, she paused. Her fingers tightened around the form, and, for a flicker of a second, her voice softened. This isn't protocol. Animals don't enter death row. Frank didn't plead, he only nodded. I understand. But if there's mercy left in this place, let it show up with 4 paws and a wagging tail. The warden gave no promise, but Frank knew something had shifted in her eyes. He returned to his cot and sat in silence, remembering how Shadow would nudge him awake before his alarm, like the dog had a 6th sense for morning. That memory, more than anything, was what kept him from breaking. Have you ever loved something so deeply you'd choose it as your last goodbye? Outside, the sky began to lighten, hinting at the arrival of day, but inside Frank waited, not for the sun, not for a miracle, just for Shadow. Across town, in a small rented house with peeling paint and wind-chapped windows, Emily Clark hadn't slept. She sat curled on the edge of her worn sofa, the same sofa she and Frank had chosen together at a flea market years ago, before his world fell apart. The early news had confirmed it. Frank Bellamy's execution would proceed at dawn. Emily's hands trembled as she held a cracked mug of coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. Across the room, Shadow, Frank's old German shepherd, lay on his bed by the radiator, ears twitching with every sound. He hadn't seen Frank in 5 years. But dogs, like memories, don't forget who they belong to. She had stood by Frank through it all, through the arrest, the trial, the silence that followed. She'd written letters no one answered, hired lawyers who gave up. Even when the world called him guilty, Emily whispered to the wind, "No, he isn't." She'd once tried to move on, boxed up photos, donated clothes, closed their joint savings account, but couldn't go through with it. His coat still hung by the door, and Shadow still waited every night by that door, tail wagging when the mail slot clicked, as if it might be him. Now a call came. Warden Monroe, her voice clipped but surprisingly gentle. "Miss Clark, Frank's final request is to see Shadow. We've been given temporary approval. You need to be here in 90 minutes. Emily dropped the mug. It shattered on the floor. Shadow leapt to his feet, sensing her panic, or maybe her hope. 90 minutes, she whispered, already reaching for the leash. "We're coming, Frank." Would you drive through a storm of grief for one last chance to say, "I never stopped loving you"? She bundled Shadow into the truck and gripped the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. With each mile toward the prison, she fought the fear that she might arrive too late. In a quiet suburb not far from the city courthouse, Detective Raymond Ray Kessler sat alone at his kitchen table, the blue light of dawn creeping through the blinds. His badge, once the symbol of a proud career, lay face down beside a cold cup of coffee. He hadn't touched either in hours. The headline on his screen read, "Final day for Frank Bellamy, execution set for sunrise." Ray's hand tightened around his phone, his finger hovered over a contact. Not the prison, not the press, but a man he hadn't spoken to in years. A tech investigator with access to things the courts had long ignored. He exhaled. 5 years ago, he had led the team that nailed Frank. The evidence had lined up like checkboxes. A partial fingerprint, a blurry eyewitness, and the victim's blood on Frank's clothes. The DA called it airtight. But Ray remembered the look in Frank's eyes during the interrogation. Not rage, not arrogance, just quiet disbelief, and that one phrase repeated over and over. "I didn't do this." At the time, Ray brushed it off. People lied under pressure, but now that memory gnawed at him. In the last 2 years, he'd quietly pulled the case file from archives again and again. There were gaps, questions never asked, leads never followed, and a gut feeling he couldn't shake. He finally made the call, It's Ray. I need everything you can find on the Connolly case. Financials, phone logs, anything off the books. I think we missed something. Or worse, someone didn't want us to find it." He ended the call, then stared out the window. What do you do when the truth whispers too late, when the clock is ticking and someone else is about to pay for your silence? Ray stood, slipped his badge into his coat pocket, not for pride but for penance, and headed out. The streets were still sleeping, but he couldn't wait another hour. He had a man to try and save. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Detective Ray Kessler slammed the door of his unmarked sedan and rushed into the county records building. His shoes echoed across the marble floor as he flashed his ID at a sleepy clerk. "Archived forensics, Bellamy case, now." Within minutes, he was buried in old boxes, files, photos, and reports sealed away like forgotten ghosts. Then, tucked between two mislabeled folders, Ray found it. A secondary forensic report, dated 3 days after the crime scene analysis. It had never been submitted at trial. He read it twice, footprints that didn't match Frank. Gunpowder residue near the scene. No gun was ever recovered. A witness statement that contradicted the timeline. Omitted, suppressed, ignored. Ray didn't know which was worse. He snapped photos, texted them to his tech contact, and bolted. On the drive to the prison, he called Warden Monroe. Her tone was calm but strained. "I hope you're not calling with a theory, Kessler. He's in the chamber wing. If you've got proof, you'd better be holding it in your hands." "I've got more than proof. I've got a second crime scene report, and it changes everything." Traffic lights blurred past. Sirens wailed. Not his own, but distant. Every red light felt like a threat. He didn't know if the governor would take a call this late, or if the DA would care. But if he didn't try, Frank would be gone. And worse, an innocent man would die because Ray didn't listen the first time. If someone's life hung on your voice, would you raise it before it was too late? At 7:42 a.m., Ray sped past the Ironwood prison gates. He leapt from the car, report in hand, heart pounding like a drum in a funeral march. There were only 78 minutes left. At 8:14 DMR's Warden Clarice Monroe stepped into the final holding cell. The heavy door groaned open, and Frank Bellamy, dressed in state-issued gray, looked up from the floor where he sat cross-legged beside Shadow, who had just arrived minutes earlier, tail thumping against tile like a drumbeat of love. Monroe's face was pale but composed. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, "there's been a development." Frank stood slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "Development?" She cleared her throat. "Detective Kessler brought us new evidence, reports we never saw. It casts significant doubt on your conviction. I've spoken with the governor's legal office." She paused. "Your execution is officially postponed. You have a 48-hour stay." The word postponed landed like thunder. Frank gripped the edge of the metal bunk. His knees weakened, not from fear, but from the sudden, disorienting possibility of hope. Shadow barked once, sensing the shift. A stay, not a pardon, not an exoneration. But the needle would not come at 9. For the first time in years, Frank had more than minutes left to count. He locked eyes with Monroe. "So I might not die today." "No," she said softly, "not today." Behind her, Chaplain Grayson exhaled sharply, offering a silent prayer. Even the guard at the door blinked hard, swallowing emotion he wasn't trained to show. Frank reached down and stroked Shadow's ear, the dog pressing closer, panting happily, as if he knew his man wasn't leaving just yet. Can you imagine feeling your life return in a single breath after already saying your final goodbye? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of what-ifs, almosts, and sudden second chances. The steel door shut gently behind Warden Monroe, leaving Frank alone with Shadow, and a ticking clock that, for the first time in years, wasn't counting down to death. Frank dropped to the cold floor again, knees stiff, heart still hammering. Shadow curled up beside him without hesitation, resting his massive head in Frank's lap. "You remember me, don't you?" Frank whispered, brushing his fingers through the soft fur now threaded with gray. The dog let out a sigh, a sound full of peace, and nudged Frank's arm, as if to say, "Of course I do." Frank smiled, tears he hadn't allowed himself in years finally breaking loose. Not the silent, stoic tears of a man alone in a cell, but the kind that shake the body and free the soul. "I thought I'd never feel this again," he murmured. "Warmth, love. You." He pulled Shadow close and closed his eyes. The sounds of the prison, the hum of fluorescence, distant keys jangling, muffled voices, faded away. All that remained was the steady rhythm of Shadow's breathing, anchoring him in the moment. Can a single touch, fur beneath your fingers, or a head resting on your lap, remind you that you're still human? There. On the tile floor, Frank remembered walks in the park, muddy paw prints in the truck, the way Shadow used to lean against him during thunderstorms. He remembered Emily's laughter, her hands, her fierce belief in him, even when the world did not. And for the first time in that place of concrete and despair, Frank didn't feel like a number. He felt like a man loved. By nightfall, Detective Ray Kessler was back in the district office, his desk buried in files he once trusted and now doubted. His eyes burned from scanning documents, but he didn't stop, not when a man's life and his conscience hung in the balance. Then it happened. An encrypted email arrived from his tech contact. The subject line chilled him. Confirmed, frame job. Ray opened the file. Dozens of bank transfers, names he recognized, corporate players, local officials, even a former police captain. All tied to one man, Gerald Marks, a developer with deep pockets and deeper secrets. Marks had been losing a major land deal to the man Frank was accused of killing. The motive was there, the money trail was proof. And one transaction, nearly $100,000 0 cents, went to a man named Nathan Graves, a known fixer with a reputation for planting evidence and making witnesses disappear. Ray swallowed hard. He remembered a strange line in the original case file. Evidence entered anonymously. A bloody knife, found by a tipster no one could identify. Now, it made terrible sense. He hit print, grabbed the files, and called the DA's office. Then he called the governor's emergency council. They'd need everything, because if Frank Bellamy was innocent, and now Ray believed he was, the state had nearly killed a man for another man's greed. Have you ever had to face the damage done by your own certainty? Ray ran a trembling hand through his graying hair. He'd spent 30 years chasing truth, but today it wasn't caught in a confession. It was buried in numbers, lies, and silence. 2 days after the stay of execution, Frank Bellamy stood in shackles inside a courtroom he never expected to see again. His face was pale, but his back was straight. Emily sat in the front row, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. And just outside, Shadow waited, tail swishing with anticipation, unaware the world was about to change again. The judge, gray-bearded and stern, reviewed the documents silently. Beside Frank, a new attorney, assigned just days ago, held the key to his future in a manila folder. Then the judge spoke. In light of newly submitted evidence, including financial records, withheld forensics, and the confession of a third party involved in the frame, we are hereby vacating the conviction of Franklin Bellamy. All charges are dropped. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the bailiff stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. Frank's wrists trembled. The weight of the metal had lived there so long, it felt unreal to let it go. He turned to Emily, eyes wide, lips trembling. She rose, stepped over the barrier, and wrapped him in an embrace that broke 5 years of silence. The courtroom didn't applaud. It didn't need to. The stillness was louder than celebration. He whispered, "I'm free." Not to her, not to anyone, but to himself, like he had to believe it aloud to make it real. What would it feel like to step out of a nightmare and realize the dawn is waiting, just for you? Outside the courthouse, Shadow lunged forward the second Frank emerged. The leash slipped from Emily's hands. Frank dropped to his knees, and the dog buried him in love that had never once wavered. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. The cameras disappeared. And Frank Bellamy, once labeled a murderer, became something far quieter. A man trying to learn how to live again. He now shared a small cottage at the edge of town with Emily and Shadow, whose favorite spot was under the porch, head resting on Frank's boots. Every morning, Frank walked the same trail they once strolled before it all began. No reporters, no cuffs. Just gravel beneath his feet and a dog by his side. But healing wasn't swift. He still jolted awake some night, sweat soaking his shirt, the sound of steel doors slamming in his mind. Sometimes he'd freeze in grocery aisles, overwhelmed by the choices and the noise. The world had kept moving. He had been standing still. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Frank sat on the porch, Shadow curled beside him. Emily joined him, 2 mugs of tea in hand. They watched the horizon quietly until she spoke. "Do you ever think about why he waited?" she asked, nodding toward the dog. Frank smiled. He didn't know how to stop loving me. Is there anything in this world stronger than the loyalty that waits, even in silence? They sipped their tea. In the stillness, Frank's breath evened out. His hands stopped shaking. Shadow lifted his head, ears alert, then relaxed again. Frank glanced at Emily. "I was saved by 3 things," he said softly. "The truth, your belief in me, and that dog's heart." Underscore, 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 There are moments in life when everything seems lost, when the world turns its back, and the silence feels louder than any defense you can give. But this story reminds us that sometimes the strongest forces are not the loudest ones. Love that waits, loyalty that doesn't waver, truth that refuses to stay buried. These are the quiet anchors that hold us steady when everything else falls apart. Frank didn't survive because he shouted the loudest. He survived because someone believed in him. A woman who never stopped loving him, a dog who never forgot him, and a truth that kept breathing beneath the weight of lies. In our own lives, we may not face prison walls, but we all know what it's like to feel unseen or misunderstood. And maybe what saves us isn't always justice in a courtroom, but a hand that holds ours, a voice that says, "I believe you," or even a dog resting quietly by our side. Sometimes, holding on is the bravest thing we can do, and sometimes, that's enough to change everything. In the quiet light of morning, Frank Bellamy sat beneath a tree with Shadow's head resting gently on his knee. No reporters, no speeches, just breath, warmth, and the steady rhythm of 2 survivors sharing the same patch of sun. It wasn't a victory parade, but it was something better. It was life. Healing doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes, it arrives in small, steady moments. Tea shared at dusk, laughter returning slowly, the sound of a door opening without fear. Frank would spend the years ahead rebuilding what was taken, but not just for himself. He would speak, quietly but firmly, so that others like him wouldn't be buried by silence again. Because this wasn't just his story, it was a reminder that justice delayed must still be justice demanded, and that the cost of forgetting is too high. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.